warm welcome to all of you to what I hope and expect is going to be a really interesting session. I'm very happy to welcome the Deputy Secretary General, and I'm really happy that he has found the time to come and say goodbye to us and use the occasion to somehow distill the experience, the absolutely extraordinary experience he has had over many decades in the UN and outside into something that we can all take with us. It's such a rich experience, both with the UN and outside, that I hope that I know that we will have a good session. I'm not going to spend more of the time, precious time, but just hand over to Jan by thanking him very much for being here. And we look forward to what you have to tell us. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Michael, and thank you very much for coming to this meeting. I felt it was a bit presumptuous for me to come to say farewell, but Michael convinced me when he last was in New York, and maybe it wasn't too hard to convince me, but it is a very special moment for me to come back to Geneva. It is, in a way, full circle. Do you hear me in the back of the room? Yes. Oh, good. It's in a way full circle because I tried to find out when it started. And it started, in fact, 1988, when I was named personal representative for the Secretary General on Iran, Iraq. In August, there was finally an end of the fighting in that horrible war. And I was here to start negotiating the peace agreement between Iran and Iraq. So I spent months here, working day and night, and briefing member states in different combinations, having press conference here 28 years ago. And then I am really a Geneva, New York product, like many of you. I see some of you that I worked with in New York, and many of you I worked in Geneva, many of you worked on the barricade somewhere in the world. It's great to see so many faces that I recognize from the past. But I was the first emergency relief coordinator, working with all the emergencies in the world. And much of the work was done here. And I was commuting more or less between New York and Geneva. I was criticized in Geneva for being too much in New York. I was criticized in New York for being too much, and vice versa. So, and by the way, in that job, I was working so hard on Somalia in particular, and Sudan, sadly. And when I finished my work, there was a reception in New York in my honor, and I was deeply honored, a little bit embarrassed. But the woman who introduced me ended in such a way that I came back on earth, because she said, and now we will ask Ms. ELIASSON, the emergency relief coordinator, to come up here and make a few remarks. Welcome, Ms. ELIASSON, the man responsible for all disasters in the world. That was what I got for having been the emergency relief coordinator. But anyway, so that was the HA. And then I was President of the General Assembly 2005 and 6. Jean-Marc, you remember when I was here several times, not least, this was extremely important, and I insisted that we should go to Geneva, was that we cannot work out a new Human Rights Council in New York. You have to go to Geneva. So I spent days here, and together with the two facilitators, co-chairs, we called them at the time. And I must say the beginning of the meeting was rather tense, but after 2 days, it was a solid cooperation, and I say without the support of the ambassadors in Geneva, we would not have reached that agreement on the 15th of March 2006. So in retrospect, I thank you or your predecessors for having cooperated on that. But that's also when I realized that it is so important that we try to see the whole of the UN, both from the member states' perspective, but also we, Michael, as an organization, to see the enormous positive that comes out of United Nations coming together from different directions, not least the Geneva, New York axis, if I may say so. Also, as Deputy Secretary General, I've been here at least 4 or 5 times. Michael who is doing, I think, an extraordinary job in making sure that we have much more of dialogue between us, and also show the great vitality of the Geneva presence of the UN. I thank you very much for that. You have invited me at least 3 or 4 times, and I have briefed, as many of you recall, twice on the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, the process in which I was involved all these 4 years. And also twice I've been briefing on the so-called Human Rights Upfront initiative, which several of you have been very strong in supporting. And also that initiative would not have its vitality without the support of the Human Rights Council, of course, but also the Geneva ambassadors. So this is all just to say full circle, and for me to be here, the last visit in my present capacity outside New York. I was in Brussels yesterday for the pledging conference on Central African Republic, which brought in $2.28 billion, and I think it's a great way of saying that we need to make sure that Central African Republic, doesn't fall into a horrible situation. They are already in trouble. Anyway, this was my next to last day, and today is my last day, and when I return to New York, it's no more travel. I will leave by the end of the year. Therefore, to be here and so do the full circle with you is just wonderful, and I want to thank you for your friendship and your cooperation. I thought I would say a few words about looking back at the UN, and perhaps looking forward also, to look at both progress and successes, and also disappointments and failures. I don't know where I should start. Should I start with the successes or failures? Let's start on the positive side, but still, because I will have also something on the negative side that I think we need to work with. But on the successes, I say that last year was, to me, the best possible year in the United Nations for laying a foundation for a new direction on development. I think the transformative nature of the sustainable goals and the combination of the SDGs with the Paris Agreement in the end of the year and the preceding agreements in Sendai on disaster risk reduction, which is very much a Geneva activity, of course, and the Addis Ababa meeting on financing for development with a truly serious participation of all actors, World Bank, IMF, private sector, and so forth. All these 4 events, processes, lays a very strong foundation for the road forward on development. I was around already, as some of you were, 2000, when the MDGs were created. I recall a discussion about efficient development assistance. I recall a discussion about relationship between donors and recipients. And if you compare that discussion with the present discussion about technology, trade, energy, transport, housing, urbanization, migration as elements, good governance, access to justice, peaceful societies, all these new aspects which make the point which we know from New York was established and has been repeated the last few years: no peace without development, no development without peace, and none of the above without respect of human rights and rule of law. And this has to be done at the same time. If one of these pillars is weak, the whole structure is weak. And I think the SDGs actually have led to a way of thinking that takes away, and should take away, the borderlines between these different activities, so that we mobilize the whole UN system. So I think the SDGs and the climate change agreement were of historic significance. Now, of course, it's very important that they turn into reality. But I'm also encouraged that we already, the first year, have talked so much about implementation. Everywhere I go, I'm presented by plans for implementation, whether it is in rich countries or in poor countries. And by the way, from the point of view of sustainability, which is the leading theme of the SDGs and the climate change agreement, in terms of sustainability, we are all developing countries. If you think about the fact that these goals are universal and should be equally applied by all, and the fact that sustainability is definitely the uniting, carrying idea, then we should really see that we all have a job ahead of us. on the basis of maintaining the goals of sustainability. I can't hide from you that on this point is an issue where we, of course, now hope very much that the momentum will not be reduced and that we will go slower on this. There is a big discussion, and I can say openly to you that this is an issue that we will be particularly very interested in discussing with the United States, that we will need to go that road forward on sustainability, on carrying out the intentions. It is an existential issue. It's a responsibility we have towards our children and grandchildren, which we cannot reduce. But we can perhaps discuss that further in the question period. Anyway, the good news there is, in my view, this great foundation laid on SDGs and the climate agreement. And here I want to really say that without the Secretary General's efforts on the climate change, we wouldn't have been where we are. He has stuck his neck out so many times. I've talked to him privately about should we really bring in a track outside COP or not, and he said we have to, otherwise we will not mobilize the political energy. There were many who didn't want that meeting 2014 where political will was added and public opinion was, I think, mobilized, but he did it and he stuck his neck out. Having carried with him a very sad memory from the meeting 2009 where he also presided. So he has taken that upon himself. I can tell you how much time and how much effort he has spent on that. Another area where I would think we have made great strides forward is in the area of migration and refugees. That's, by the way, another area where we need to have discussions with the incoming American administration, because the New York Declaration on migration and refugees is important, setting the direction not only for the work on refugees, but also on migration, the upcoming conference 2018. And then a third element, which might be more politically sensitive than when we signed on to it, namely the program, the campaign, in fact. We are asked by the member states to conduct or to make the member states take over on xenophobia. So there are three elements of that refugee migration meeting, namely refugees, migration, and xenophobia. And that is to be carried out by all member states at the request of the member states. So this area is crucial, especially since there is a tendency in the world sometimes to see refugees and migration as a problem and a peril rather than a potential and a possibility. We should remember the economic effects proved by IMF and OECD of the economic value of migration. Show that we would have negative population growth in Western Europe and US in particular without migrants, and that the remittances from migrants is 3 times, or at least 2.5 times larger than all official development assistance. And personally, I can't refrain from saying that if you look back at our nation states, your nation state, they are all composed of groups of different religions, ethnic identities, tribes, and the whole idea is, of course, to come to the natural conclusion that diversity is a source of strength, not a source of weakness. I would say I see even a beauty in diversity, and I think those nations that accept diversity are the ones that are going to be the strongest in the long run. Although in the short term, it's absorption problems, problems in local communities, which certainly we have seen, not least in Europe. I am from Sweden, as you know, and we, like many European countries, are facing this. But I think that's another place, and also on this count, I'm grateful for your support from Geneva to this process that Bill Swing and I, in particular, have worked with the now inclusion of IOM as a related organization to the UN. I met Bill Swing last week in New York. We had the Chief Executive Board meeting, and he was there as a full member, and smiles were all around the building. And we look forward to having IOM's contribution, not least, of course, to the Migration Conference 2018. Another point I would like to mention, and I don't know to what degree I have 100% support of you, but I hope I have pretty high support, and that is the human rights up front, which is not only meant to show the importance of human rights as one of the 3 pillars, but it is also meant as a prevention measure. I have mediated, I think, in 6 different conflicts, and when I look back at those conflicts and other conflicts, I have discovered that violations of human rights is very often an early sign of a conflict. And having drawn that conclusion, I have said to myself, asked myself a rhetorical question: if we know that human rights violations can lead to mass atrocities, ethnic cleansing, even genocide, why don't we then discuss acting at the human rights violation stage rather than waiting for the atrocity stage? I think it's a pretty convincing question, especially since you can see that these atrocities turn into sometimes civil wars, which in today's world, as you know, look around the map, easily can turn into proxy wars. If you look at the horror of Syria, if there had been a Security Council resolution in the summer of 2012, at that time, by the way, ISIS did not even exist. It was much more different from waiting these years and now seeing that this conflict will not be resolved unless we have agreement on 3 levels. We have to have an agreement on the great power level, particularly US and Russia. We need to have agreement on the region level, particularly Saudi Arabia, Turkey and Iran, and Qatar perhaps, and Egypt. But we need to have agreement with the parties. And you know how much the opposition is split and how many terrorist groups are in fact fighting on the ground, making that unity in the opposition group more difficult. So my conclusion has been that the sooner we get in, the sooner we end the conflict, the better. I wish we could have seen an end to the war in Yemen 2 or 3 months after the conflict, rather than now still trying to get the parties to the negotiation table. So human rights up front is meant to be then a way of going to the member states in transparency, discussing the issues, and avoiding conflicts, and even go to the Security Council if needed to discuss issues early on. In fact, those of you who read know the Charter, which I carry in my pocket, this is my 12th version since 1980. Prevention is spelled out in the first article of the UN. It's Chapter 1, Article 1 says that the purpose of the UN is to maintain international peace and security and to take effective collective measures for the prevention and removal of threats to the peace. What is threat? Threat is before this happened. And then you read Article 33, Article 34, Pacific Settlement Disputes, everything we should do. And we as diplomats, this is our job. This is our job. Diplomacy, prevention, mediation, arbitration, this beautiful job we have. We're not doing that enough. So I think, therefore, to have some way of saying that, not only prevention being a rhetorical word that you throw around that we have done for the last 20 years, but then setting up a concrete program of prevention. And that is what human rights up front is meant to be. The last positive thing that I would hope would happen, but I talked to Michael about this walking down here. We are not there yet, but I would hope that we would really develop a thinking in the United Nations. It is growing, but we're not home yet, of understanding that each agency, each fund, each program has its own mandate, and they should be very good in its mandate, in its vertical work, in its silo, if you so like. But my experience is that you must combine the knowledge, expertise, and respect for the mandate with combining with others when it comes to solving problems. So once you do your job, but out in the field in particular, you've got to go horizontal and make sure that you work with others. I think the effectiveness of the UN would increase enormously if we really work around the problem and not along the bureaucratic organization, and work horizontally when it comes to solving problems. I was encouraged when I was in Vietnam. and Nepal recently, to see how in the midst of, as a consequence of the disaster, the earthquake in Nepal, there was no difference between what the humanitarians were doing and the development people. And by the way, there is now much more discussion between humanitarian and developing community. I'm glad you've contributed to that here in Geneva. And this horizontal method, I think, needs to really would be going forward. And I think we have, and you have a chance now with Antonio Guterres coming in as Secretary General with his background as a political leader of a government, but also head of an agency located here in Geneva, and knowing the specialized agency perspective, but now being head of the organization. So I think it's a good opportunity, and my preliminary contacts with him confirm that he wants to go that direction. Okay, on the negative side, maybe this could be shorter. Syria, of course. I don't think I need to spell that out. I think it's a collective failure of the United Nations. It's a collective failure of the parties, of course, not to end this horror. I ask myself, can it get worse? And it does. It does get worse. We asked ourselves, could it have these effects on the neighboring countries? Yes, it had. Could it really have a political effect on the political life in Europe? Yes, it has. And could it have an effect in dividing people into us and them around the world? Yes, it has. Has it damaged the relationship between the countries in the Middle East? Yes, it has. Has it damaged the relationship US and Russia? Yes, it has. And you ask yourself, can it get worse? And I can tell you, yes, it can still get worse. It can still get worse. And I say very openly to you now that I wish we had taken, the Security Council had taken that binding resolution back in 2012. What on the surface prevented that from happening was a discussion about whether Chapter 7 would be used or not. But I think the real reason was that there was on both sides the hope, expectations that this matter could be settled militarily. And that illusion is still there. That illusion is still there. So here I can show no light. I'm impressed by the work of Kofi Annan, Lakhdar Brahimi, Staffan de Mistura. Thousands of hours of discussions with them from New York and here with them. I just came from a conversation with Ramsey and his team. Staffan is on travel. They still, of course, want to have this three-stage operation. 1, reduce the level of violence. 2, make sure we can have humanitarian access. 3, use this situation for starting the political process on the basis of reaching a transition. And then in the end, of course, the constitutional work and elections. All that model is still there, and I think we need to stick to it. The other bad news, but also something one should analyze, is the more difficult situation for peacekeeping. When I was in Sweden, Veronica, I remember Sweden had 80,000 people in peacekeeping through the years. Being a peacekeeper was going to a place and being accepted as a peacemaker, accepted by everybody. There was no discussion about us not being impartial. Now, in conflicts like Mali and several others, we are the targets. And then we are not trained to fight wars or being in battle situation. On the other hand, we are asked by the Security Council to protect civilians. And then how do we do that? In some cases, we do it with great vigor and great courage, like when we opened the gates in South Sudan, 2014, to let the Noors in, or Dinkas, with different parts of the country, and we were in between mobs and inside, people inside. We did that in the spirit of human rights up front, by the way, that decision. But we also failed, like we did in South Sudan, when civilians were not protected, and decisions were taken which were very harsh by the Secretary General. We also sacked, or asked people to resign. I should perhaps take out that word. Asked a person to resign in Central African Republic after the sexual exploitation abuse that was taking place, which was horrible. A zero tolerance program has to be implemented. So I must admit that the peacekeeping operations are, first of all, working under much more difficult conditions than they did when I started in the UN. And then secondly, that it is hard to fulfill, really live up to the protection of civilians, particularly in the day and age when you see it better than most, there is such a decay, neglect of international humanitarian law. 5 hospitals were attacked again in Aleppo, can you imagine? And they are evidently targets now. This is war crimes. People don't even seem to know the elements of the Geneva Convention. So for peacekeepers to be in that environment where there is such serious neglect of international humanitarian law is not an easy thing. But I can't defend anything in this area of sexual exploitation and abuse. And one thing that I want to say to you, which has been a very difficult issue for many of us, for me personally also, is this long period we have had to wait for having the immunity established in the case of cholera in Haiti, where for a long time we were seen as being absolutely rigid on accepting any responsibility. Now when this has been established by the district court in New York, the Secretary General has asked me to develop a new approach which contains a couple of elements. One being that we should seriously and substantially stand behind fighting cholera in Haiti. We are aiming for a $200 million program to end cholera. You know that over 9,000 people have died in cholera since it broke out after the earthquake and after some of the reasons why it broke out. And then we had, as you know, the hurricane, this monstrous hurricane. So this country has taken such huge hits, and we feel now it's time for us to show solidarity, and we do it by A, developing this program for fighting cholera, B, identifying those who were immediately affected by the outbreak, if we can, to try to reach those communities who were affected, with a similarly high program of $200 million. And then we are discussing to what degree and how we formulate our regrets or our apologies to the Haitian people. This will be done in a speech by the Secretary General on the 1st of December, and we're working hard on that. So I admit that Syria is a failure. Haiti did reputational damage to us. Sexual exploitation and abuse is absolutely unacceptable, did reputational damage. And then we have the complex operations that become so difficult because of the ethnic or religious factors that come into conflicts. Syria is one example, but also South Sudan. But I think that's a problem that we share with the member states to deal with this. But I want to say to you all together that we are an indispensable organization, but we have to prove our value. I think in today's world, if we don't prove that institutions work, whether it is a government, a regional organization like European Union, or an international organization like the UN, if we don't prove that we can deliver what people expect, I think people will turn away from us. And they will look for different directions. They will look for identity in primordial terms like their ethnic identity, and they will look at outside actors as a problem. We have to really, in my view, fight that trend. And we who are internationalists and part of the international community, we have to develop a positive narrative about the positives of opening up to the outside world, in a world where there is such strong inward tendencies. And if we don't do that, if we don't make it credible for our voters, for our people, then I think we are in for a very, very difficult period. And I think we need to really work hard on that narrative and come to the conclusion, and that's not easy, but in my view it's absolutely convincing. You simply cannot find national solutions to the problems of today. It is logically and conceptually impossible to think there is a national solution to climate change, or that there is a national solution to migration and refugees. It's impossible. So if you accept that you need to have an international solution, then in my view, if you then have a negotiated solution like the one we got on SDGs or on climate change, then that solution is in the national interest. Can you imagine the day coming that the international solution that you negotiate here in Geneva or your colleagues in New York, that solution is in the national interest? When the editorial writers write so, when the politicians in the parliament say that, then we have a breakthrough. But I would say today the trend is in the other direction, that international cooperation isn't necessarily helpful and doesn't really help our national interests. So that's why we have to get, I would say, on the barricades with a positive narrative. Thank you very much. Thank you.
much, Deputy Secretary General. I open up the floor for comments, questions. Austria will start. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. It's wonderful to have you here, Jan.